Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald, and also here, Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Not the first time I've done that, won't be the last. Hello, Kirsty.
Oh, gone back in time there for a minute. Hi.
And Joe Tanner is usually here, but political strategist Joe Tanner is currently on safari in South Africa for her
With the
honeymoon.
real big beasts.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, she's doing all right. She was sending us some pictures earlier. She seems to be locking them in, which is very impressive. Also, it's worth noting that Joe was very like, I will do the podcast. I'll do the podcast. And we were like, it's your honeymoon, Joe. I think maybe you should be there. So Joe has got this week off, but she'll be back soon. Thank you so much for being with us on the Whitehall Sources podcast. You, of course, can watch this on YouTube as well. Just search for Whitehall Sources. And if you've any thoughts to share on what you're hearing or questions to ask, then please feel free to get in touch. You can WhatsApp us on 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Whitehall. Kirsty, we'll get to our special guest in just a few moments on the podcast, but I want to start with something that I think is escalating. I think it's becoming more of an issue for the government at the time of speaking. So we're recording on Wednesday afternoon. A couple of hours ago, Keir Starmer confirmed that the government will publish critical evidence in the China spying case that led to the collapse of a trial of two people, Christopher Cash and Christopher Berry, who had been charged with spying-related offences, which they have always denied, and which, as I say, the CPS had to drop in the end. The Prime Minister told MPs this lunchtime that he has decided to publish 3 witness statements that were shared with prosecutors, quote, in full. He's blamed the last government for this failed prosecution. He was speaking at Prime Minister's questions. He said this is Starmer, said the evidence had been shared with prosecutors and it will be published. There have been weeks of pressure on the government around this case, Kirsty, and I think that in itself is not a bad place to start, because it strikes me as a kind of journalist in pursuit of answers that when a story is bubbling for weeks, first of all, it suggests that we're not getting all the answers particularly quickly, and two, almost by default, it means there are more answers in which we are pursuit of. And so we haven't got the whole story. Are we any closer to having the whole story at this point, do you think?
No, not at all. For all the Prime Minister's bombast at the dispatch box today, actually there are a lot of questions, critical questions, that remain unanswered. Look, the central charge here against the government is that it has deliberately allowed a case of spying against China to collapse because it is politically inconvenient for them at a time where they're trying to woo China in terms of getting more trade. That is the central charge. The central question, which remains even after PMQs today, is the CPS, which decides, an independent body that decides whether there is enough evidence to prosecute, decided and in fact told the 2 MPs for whom these people were working that the case was a slam dunk case. But somewhere in between them having enough evidential base to charge and going to court, the case collapsed. The CPS's contention has always been that the case collapsed because despite repeated requests for this government to hand over the evidence that China was deemed to be a threat to British interests, that evidence was not forthcoming, and that is why they could not continue with the prosecution. What we heard today from Starmer is an admission for the first time, something that both, I think, the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister's official spokesman, and the Security Minister, Dan Jarvis, at the dispatch box earlier this week, had denied that it happened, was a meeting between the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, and the DPS. And shortly after that meeting, the case kind of withdrew. The charge is what happened at that meeting. Can we see the minutes of it? If there's nothing to see there, let's publish them and we can get a sense of whether there was or wasn't any kind of interference on that. Starmer has refused to publish the minutes of that meeting. He said he will publish the evidence of the Deputy National Security Advisor, which, by the way, is slightly of a red herring, because whatever else is contested in this, I think it's clear that whatever Matthew Collins, the Deputy National Security Advisor, provided, it wasn't sufficient. And so what we've seen from the government is an attempt to shift the blame from a political appointment, Jonathan Powell is appointed by Keir Starmer, to a civil servant, which in its own right is not a good look. And they're trying to have us believe, which I have to say, having worked as a senior civil servant and as a special advisor, frankly beggars belief that the Deputy National Security Advisor, completely unilaterally and without any oversight at all, knowing full well that the CPS didn't think that there was enough evidence based on what he'd already handed over, just sat back and didn't talk to anybody about that. Didn't discuss it with his interim's boss, Jonathan Powell, didn't raise it with any ministers. He unilaterally decided to let one of the most important spying cases in probably modern British history collapse and not talk to anybody about it. I'm not buying it. I don't think anybody's buying that.
It's fascinating too, because just this afternoon, the Times is reporting an exclusive story that China, this is the headline on the Times website, China stole classified state secrets and it was covered up. Now, this is a claim from Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's former senior advisor. He said that he and the Prime Minister had been informed about the breach in 2020. Prime Minister at the time, I should say, Boris Johnson. Dominic Cummings claims he was warned that disclosing specific details of the breach would, in fact, be a criminal offence. I mean, this is just the next sort of dramatic part of the question of China's, I suppose, interest, involvement, infiltration, even in kind of UK society. Kirsty, what you were saying there about your experiences as a special advisor and a civil servant, I think, are something just to zoom in on before we welcome our guest, Lord Walney, into the conversation too. Because I think it would be helpful for us to understand what the differences in those roles are and why there's an important distinction and why that's relevant to this particular case. Jonathan Powell is a political appointee and the Deputy National Security Advisor as a civil servant.
Yeah, and the pinhead on which Keir Starmer is currently balanced is Jonathan Powell is not Matthew Collins' line manager, and therefore he wouldn't necessarily have oversight over what Matthew Collins is doing. Look, anybody that's worked with a civil service or been a civil servant will know that hardwired into the DNA of any civil servant is to cover your back. You just don't take unilateral decisions. It is just not done. I think I've told you the joke before about, I have gone over to the other side of the room to talk to a civil servant because I don't want something on email. And I'll even explain to them and say, look, I just want to have this quick chat off the record. I don't want a kind of paper trail on it. Not because I'm doing anything nefarious, but for various different reasons. I just don't want it written down. And by the time I have gone back to my desk, that same civil servant has written, we spoke. You said this. We agreed to do that. Now, that's on relatively minor stuff. If you have a hardwired culture to cover your back like that, it is just inconceivable to me that Matthew Collins would have allowed this case to collapse without the tacit or otherwise approval of anybody else. And if that is the case, that is such a catastrophic failure of oversight in its own right that alone should deserve some heads to roll. And we're now in a position where 3 cabinet secretaries, 2 former heads of MI6, 1 former head of the DPP, and 1 former national security advisor is saying in terms to the government what my young kids would say is the maths on this is not mathing. In other words, this isn't adding up.
Well, I think actually let's bring in our guest for today, who, it has to be said, was kind of booked on on other particular issues, which we will get to. But Lord Walney, John Woodcock, former extremism advisor to the government, an expert in political violence and disruption and counter-extremism, crossbench peer at this point as well. Lord Walney, John, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Calum. Hi, Kirsty.
It's great to see you. I just wondered if you've got a take on this, actually, and the kind of what it gets at when it comes to the functioning of government, and also more than that, the government's relationship with China, which I think is being so tested in these last couple of weeks, even as announcements of investment from China are announced in things like renewable energy in Scotland in the last week or so, £1.5 billion heading in the way of renewable energy investment, while this spy scandal is still bubbling. What are you making of it?
Yeah, I think what you say about the wider question of what our relationship with China ought to be is the principal reason why this case, this story is as salient as it is. In the list of former posts I've had, which you kindly read out, I would add to that also former political spokesman to Prime Minister Gordon Brown in Downing Street, and what Kirsty says about the culture of decision making absolutely rings true there. But the wider question, and the reason why this is, I think, such a tension and embarrassment for the government, is that our official policy towards China does not align to the reality. Is China a security threat to the United Kingdom? Yes, of course it is, in a host of ways, including very much how aggressive it is at espionage. But we are in a position at the moment where the government refuses to acknowledge that fact in its public statements, for reasons of laudable reasons of wanting to improve its economic relationship with China as a driver of growth in the economy. But I think, is that in the short-term interest of the UK? Well, I can understand why people would make that view, but isn't it in our longer-term interest? Well, no, I think it clearly isn't, because we have to be honest about this relationship. Important, absolutely, that it is, but we also, I think, have to be honest with our own population and also in our dealings with China about where the problems and the challenges are. And I just don't actually think it works for us in the longer term to just try to defy reality by refusing to call a spade a spade.
Yeah, I think it's I can't help but feel the fact it's rumbling. Just there's so much to get at from here on out as well. Why is there a difficulty in defining, I suppose, threats to the country? What strikes me as well about this is that there's been a lot of talk about, China's not been designated a threat. Somebody on Times Radio just this week was making the point, well, there isn't a list. It's not like you kind of write it down and pull it off the shelf and say, here's the list of kind of threats to the country. There's such a kind of odd lack of process almost in all of that.
But the language is really important. And I remember when Lord Robertson, George Robertson, former Defence Secretary, former NATO Secretary General, was brought in by this government to lead the Strategic Defence Review and did really important work. It was a great appointment. And I remember on the first day or the first public outing, when he talked about 3 deadly threats to the UK, of which China was one. I don't think he said that again, because that clearly was not the language. And Beijing is really aggressive. It has a long history of putting administrations in the deep freeze if they say something that we don't want. If we, wave from across the street at the Dalai Lama, or there's a whole list of ways in which Beijing can be offended. And we are pursuing a strategy of which Jonathan Powell is clearly a key part at saying, no, we do want to recalibrate this relationship, because the economic value of closer ties, which can only be unleashed with a different attitude, is such that it's worth us doing that. But the peril, I think, is in ignoring how the scale of threat that China poses to the whole of the West in the medium term. And ultimately, I don't, in the longer term, think that we gain strength or we gain respect from China by just doing it what it wants and glossing over and refusing to name the challenges and the threats that just are clearly there in open sight.
Thank you, Lord Walney, for your thoughts on what is clearly a developing and moving story, which we will return to on the pod. Let's turn to our kind of broader conversation that we were welcoming you onto the podcast to have today. We've been conversing on the pod in the last number of weeks now about protests, pro-Palestine protests as an example, the Unite the Kingdom protests that Tommy Robinson led in London last month, the difficulties that politics is having with kind of connecting with people, and how that is being played out, I suppose, in the affection that voters appear to have, according to polling, for more populist parties and challenger parties, if I can put it like that as well. And that has been a basis of so much of our conversation in these last number of weeks and months now, actually. And I wonder if I could put this to you. Do you think Britain has become a more divided nation? And when should we pinpoint a starting point for that? versus where we're at now?
Yeah, I think we are divided, and the public are angry and fed up in the main. And I think you can track the deterioration in the faith in the political process probably from the point of the financial crash in 2008, and the alarming statistic that we're in the longest period since the Napoleonic War where living standards in Britain have not risen. It has taken its toll over the years, and it's got to the point where people's faith in their elected politicians of the mainstream parties is so low now, and they feel that they have not been listened to on the issue of immigration and lack of integration in their communities by this sense of a political class whose parties change but the approach doesn't change in the minds of the public, that they are now ready to embrace more radical solutions and go beyond the mainstream. And I think that some of the that sense of the Unite the Kingdom protests, those is a symptom of that, and it is a perilous moment for mainstream politicians.
Are they rising to the challenge, I suppose? And I suppose within that there is the question of what's fueling polarization.
Yeah.
Is it just that we are experiencing a heightened time of what have always been divisive issues? I think of the Middle East, which has been a debate and a division point for, decades, if not centuries, frankly. And that is intensified by social media, for example. What are the factors at play here?
Yeah, the overall politicians, I think, are not rising to the challenge. And that is not unique in the UK. You can see it across the West, where frankly, the liberal democracies and modern economies are not seen to be delivering for the public, and and in large, the desire of populations to have a very different approach on immigration may either not be shared by the people in power, or I think quite often is shared, but is very hard to deliver the kind of change or restriction that people want. And I think why are the Gaza marches as a toxic an element of our politics as they are? Well, I think there is a level of extremism and radicalism on display at the margins of those marches, which is genuinely alarming for many people looking at it. The focus has been on the safety in the sense of intimidation of Jewish people, but I think a lot of the public look at the on their streets and think this just isn't right, and it is a symbol of the level of lack of integration and a change in our country, that a conflict which is happening literally thousands of miles away, which the British government has at best a very tangential influence in being able to is nevertheless dominating town centres in the way that it has done.
Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood has said that she's going to review the impact of particularly those pro-Palestinian marches and look at what I think you have identified before in a report to the government last year about the impact of cumulative disruption. So in other words, the marches by and large are peaceful.
Yeah.
But when we can talk about some of the language involved in those, but by and large peaceful. But the overall impact of marches again and again and again are effectively turning our cities into no-go areas for British Jews. Do you think, though, that Shabana Mahmood seems to be talking about routes and timings as opposed to actually saying, no, this march just can't go ahead at all? Is that your understanding of where she's at? And do you think that's enough at the moment?
Yeah, exactly. You go to the heart of the point, and I can direct readers towards my rather substantial review on this and other issues,
It's
which
a
was
heavy
published
tone.
last year. I mean, it's only 300 pages and 100,000 words, and it's an excellent doorstop, if nothing else. Exactly as you say, I think Shabana is a really impressive and can be a really impressive Home Secretary, and she clearly does understand the problem that the marches have caused, and I absolutely welcomed her approach to this in saying that the right to protest does not necessarily equate to the right to be out on the streets in force, in numbers, every single week, and that is balance between the protection of communities and the disruption to communities. However, the remedy that she has put on the table is not currently sufficient, because, as you say, she is talking about changing the law to give the police the power to impose conditions on a march, to change its timing, to change its route, which is
Which are powers they already have.
Exactly, because the last government change brought in that exact power so that that cumulative impact of marches taking place week after week could be factored into that. And it's not proved sufficient. The government is saying that they will look at the recommendation that I and others are making to apply that to the ability to say no to a march on a particular day, but they haven't yet agreed to it. The second reading of the crime and policing bill is in the Lords this week, and then there will be a lengthy committee process because the bill is massive and it deals with a whole host of issues. So there is time for them to sort this out and to get it on the statute book. And it's not a silver bullet, but I think it will make a difference.
So you would want the government to amend that legislation rather than having a kind of rebel amendment put down at this stage?
Yeah, look, I mean, I will. I've been clear throughout with the ministers that I will put down my amendment, and we'll see the level of support that it gets in the Lords. But they can do this. They've already pledged to put a government amendment to the bill to do what, as you say, essentially the bill already does on applying conditions to deal with the cumulative impact of marches. So they can just tweak that and apply it to the bit of the Public Order Act which deals with saying no to a march, not just putting a condition on it.
There is a sense here as well, isn't there, that there is something of a, you hear this criticism from the right particularly all the time, that there is a sort of two-tier attitude to this. It is inconceivable to me that if Tommy Robinson and his Unite the Kingdom band decided to have fortnightly marches of the size and scale that we saw relatively recently in London, that the government wouldn't put a stop to that in quick order. In essence, because it would make it a hostile environment for Muslims, it would make it a hostile environment for Black Britons, and even though there is some diversity on those marches, and even though those marches are mostly peaceful and mainly there to highlight the issues of uncontrolled migration, I think there is a feeling that actually if those marches went on at the sort of regularity that we've seen pro-Palestinian marches, they would be curbed in a heartbeat.
Yeah,
Do you think
exactly so. And it's a point I regularly try to make to my colleagues in the House of Lords, that we subconsciously look at this in different ways depending on what the cause is. Now, I think the flip side of this is that if the government does accept my recommendation, people on the right are going to have to accept that it might actually end up applying to demonstrations about asylum hotels as well, and all of us, from whatever political perspective we come, can often look at things differently depending on what our perspective is. But it's really important that we try to put aside whatever we think about the nature of the cause which is being demonstrated about, and apply the law uniformly.
And so, to be clear, your amendment is giving the Home Secretary the power to say no to a specific march on a specific day. Is
Well,
that
but to be technical about it, it would give the police, it would widen the ability of the police, it would widen the conditions that they can look at to recommend to the Home Secretary that she says no to a march, because that's a process at the moment. The police have to make an assessment to say, we don't think this march should go ahead. They put to the Home Secretary, and she makes a view. But the criteria on which marches can be recommended to be stopped at the moment are either the reasonable risk of serious public disorder, which is effectively a riot, or serious disruption. And cumulative disruption applies in placing conditions on the march, but it doesn't apply in that section 13, which is about recommending a march is stopped.
Mhm. And just consider the actual policing of these sorts of marches, or any political protest for that matter. I think, again, there's a feeling, that on the one hand, the police will turn up, 6 armed police officers will turn up at Heathrow Airport to arrest a comedian and playwright for making a not particularly funny joke about trans people. But on the other hand, we'll let, hundreds of people in those marches of thousands of people march through the streets shouting, globalise the Intifada, and do nothing about it. Isn't some of the problem simply that the police aren't policing these protests properly?
Yeah, it is. And I think there are two separate things that are happening here. There is one, the way in which different forms of what is deemed to be speech is deemed to be extreme or acceptable or not. And the Graham Linehan case was, it's just extraordinary. The fact that you got the arrest there. And then I think what you often have on these marches is a much more nuanced approach from the police, who I think it is a really difficult job that they have, but they have erred towards the interpretation of some of this sloganeering to say that it is peaceable and therefore acceptable, when I think in context, when you are talking about globalizing the Intifada, while you're on a march about Gaza, and in Gaza, Hamas are conducting an Intifada as a violent terrorist organization, then it is entirely reasonable to say that Intifada suggests violence on UK streets as well. But so often you will have, jihad can mean a struggle, and therefore a non-violent struggle, and therefore we can't arrest. So I think sometimes that's happened. Often there is just a lack of understanding, really, of what these terms mean. And one of the recommendations in my review, available online and in my office, if you want a copy.
And all the bookshops?
Not in all good bookshops, actually, I have to say, but there you are. It is that there needs to be a better mechanism for the police to be able to share with their officers real-time changes in what slogans can mean and the context of them. So that is also needed. But then a separate thing that is happening is that police officers will make a judgment that if they are if they're in the face of a march where thousands of people are going along, and sometimes hundreds, sometimes scores, sometimes even one or two, saying something or demonstrating a placard which is just clearly beyond reaching the line of a criminal act, they will sometimes be reluctant to arrest that person or those people in the moment, because they will often prioritize maintaining public order and not escalating a situation where if you try and grab one guy out of the crowd, then like all his mates sort of pile in, and then you've got a massive problem. And look, I understand that, because there is a level of policing by consent, and they are outnumbered by a factor of many, many times to one in terms of the protesters. But what that ends up with is that you get a situation where it's like sometimes the sole Jewish counter-protester who's holding up a sign saying Hamas is a terrorist organization is the one that gets arrested, basically just to take them out of the situation, to avoid an escalation into disorder. And that seems just intrinsically unfair to everyone looking at it.
One thing that strikes me, Lord Walney, having spoken to many of those who have taken part in these protests over the last couple of years particularly, is something of a willful ignorance about the anti-Semitism that has been on display, that we have seen pictures of, that we have heard audio and video recordings of as well, and a reluctance, it would appear to me, to call that out from within their own kind of broad movement. And it's something I put to a protester just a couple of weekends ago, in fact. And, she said, well, I've never seen any evidence of anti-Semitism on these marches. I said, that's fine. As unbelievable as that is, even if we take your word for it, you can't not have seen the pictures and the videos and heard the chanting in social media videos and whatever. And I just wonder, from your expertise, from your studies, how much that intensifies the situation when a movement is so at odds with itself that it can't call out very visible demonstrations of, in this case, anti-Semitism. How powerful would it be if the opposite were true? If a movement that claims to be largely about peace for Gaza was to call out anti-Semitism?
Yeah, absolutely. But they can't do it because for many of those who were driving this, it wasn't actually really at foundation about a ceasefire for the Gazan people. At the foundation of this is their deep antipathy to the idea of and underlying that is the sense it's not simply that Palestinians were displaced, it was the fact that they were displaced by Jews. And it's the idea that at the foundation of this, it is for many people, I'm afraid, that the idea of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East, of Jews being there, is abhorrent. And therefore, it is hard for even if they had the intent to do it, which I don't think that they do, part of tackling the anti-Semitism would be to say, why are we obsessing about this conflict to the exclusion of all of the other conflicts around the world where there is great levels of suffering, where Muslim people are being persecuted and killed in large numbers? And the reason is because Israel does it, and they hate the idea of Israel.
Can I ask about campus activism? Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, put out some kind of woolly statement this week saying that vice-chancellors of our universities must do everything they could to stamp out on anti-Semitism on our campuses and make these places feel safe again for Jewish students, which they haven't been for a very long time. And every single university is a signed up member of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and they are all avowed to stamp out, quite rightly, to stamp out racism and discrimination. That seems to be, increasingly, when I look around at some of the cases we've seen recently, not worth the paper that it's written on. The University of Sussex got a significant fine earlier on this year because of its failure to kind of stamp out the activism that led to the disgraceful removal of Dr. Kathleen Stock from her position for her gender-critical views. Do you think that the time has come? I mean, I can remember way back, 2016, 2017, people saying, universities ought to be fined for failures to stamp out on discrimination and not making safe places for Jewish students. Do you think the time has come for stopping asking vice chancellors nicely and just to start fining them?
It's a really interesting idea, and you're right that the situation is not working at the moment, and you have got campuses which many Jewish students do feel are just a hostile place to be. I have messages. A message from a student I had contact with in Leeds University last week, and so it's showing the really abhorrent material that is there. And I think what you're getting at the moment is an unnecessary conflation from the leadership of universities sometimes to say, oh, well, you can't, on the one hand, government tell us that we've got to uphold freedom of speech, and on the other hand, complain about when we allow this stuff to happen on campuses. And for me, it's actually pretty simple. The freedom to speak your mind and express views is not the freedom to intimidate and harass. And too often people mistake one for the other. And so I would, yes, I would like a firmer approach. I will go away and reflect on the idea of what that could be in terms of deterrent. But I think we also need to do a better job at helping the leadership of universities and other institutions be able to distinguish between genuine freedom of speech and actions that are intended to intimidate people.
Lord Walney, I want to consider, I suppose, some of the key characters in this chapter of our history. Nigel Farage is one of them, I think. The Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick is another. Nigel Farage has been accused of sort of peddling racist policies. I think proposals around pledging to abolish indefinite leave to remain might be one such policy that attracts that sort of criticism. Robert Jenrick's been accused of racism for his comments about integration as well. There is a consideration about Overton window that we have made on this podcast before. Where is language moving to, and what do we consider to be acceptable? I wonder what your take is on that. Are these kind of, is it fair comment, or is it kind of inflammatory hysteria?
Well, I think it is a dead end for the centre and the left to brand the likes of Nigel Farage and Robert Jenrick as racist, because they are expressing the frustration with the immigration system and the lack of integration, which is now deeply, deeply held by big swathes of the country. And whether you have that view of people or not, you are effectively allowing them to increase their supports further by saying to the public, hey, look, these ministers are so out of touch that they're branding you racist for being concerned about the things that you are. And I think it's incumbent on the Labour government to do stuff that actually moves the dial on immigration and integration, because the credibility of all mainstream politicians now is so low that people are just not prepared to take tough statements on board from people who've been in power. That probably actually includes Robert Jenrick as well, no matter how far he pushes out the boat in rhetoric. They have to actually do stuff, and calling your opponents racist just it really, really muddles people's understanding of what it is that you want to do.
How do you walk the line, though, John? How do you walk the line between challenging, what is clearly on the populist right, a desire to exploit the grievances of voters as much as it is to echo or empathise with the grievances of voters? How do you call that out without walking into this, as you say, kind of political dead end on it?
So I think in terms of indefinite leave to remain, I think probably my response would be, look, this isn't going to work. This is going to tear apart families and affect people who have actually lived in and contributed in this country for decades. That's not an effective way to tackle this problem. What we want to do actually is radical action to stop the boat, and determination to tackle the situation that we do have in too many of our towns and cities where communities are leading parallel lives. So let's do this rather than focus on this ineffective stuff.
Surely it must be right to call out Farage when he I don't mean about indefinite leave to remain, but on the one hand, he says, "Oh, if you say this, you're putting me at risk." And obviously, we saw that chap go down for 5 years for threats to kill. And obviously, George Finch, one of the youngest, I think, the youngest county council leader for reform, also was attacked this week. So I get the point about language feeding into kind of political violence, but at the same time, this is the party that invited Lucy Connolly onto the stage at Reform Conference, treated her like some sort of free speech martyr, when she actually suggested, in the middle of a highly inflammatory, high temperature situation, that people should go and burn migrants in their hotels. This is not a political prisoner.
No, exactly. And I think this is a profound overreach, actually, by by Farage and those who are defending Lucy Connolly. Because I can understand, you look at that and you think, God, that is a very harsh sentence. And I was personally surprised that her appeal was not successful in terms of lessening the sentence. But yes, she was endorsing that violent action at a time when those things were happening. So there was incitement, and there was much more tangible incitement than the nonsense idea of Nigel Farage being at greater risk because of that speech from Keir Starmer. Nigel Farage does have a level of risk. It is a worry. He deserves protection, but it wasn't increased by what Starmer said. I think what Starmer said was unwise for those other political reasons, not for public safety reasons.
Are you more worried, John, about the kind of language and the behaviour that you see from the hard left at the moment, or the language and the behaviour that you see from the populist right, or the alt-right, or the radical right, or the hard right, whatever you want to call it?
I think we do have to be really vigilant about the kind of protests that many people who are just genuinely worried about migration or about asylum hotels in their constituency being effectively inflamed into violence in the way that some parts of the far right may seek to do. That is going to be a constant threat going forwards. But key part of my brief in being brought into government as independent advisor on political violence was to look at to assess the government's understanding of the threat posed by the far left and whether more needed to be done. And it was clear to me that while in the main this is not, thankfully, at the moment, a violent threat in the way that you see in some parts of the Antifa movement in the US, and let's hope that that continues, there is nevertheless a challenge to our democratic norms and institutions, and often a level of intolerance and anti-Semitism that can be fueled by organized actors in the far left who can be supported by hostile states such as Russia and Iran in the ways in which they have done for many decades, but now have social media and other ways in which they can have.
Yeah. Just a final concluding thought for you, Lord Walney, is that this particular moment of division and difficulty and protest and strife feels intensified by perhaps the cost of living crisis and the feeling among the public that things are just broken, that things aren't working. And it's a tale and a lesson as old as time itself, is it not? That when a society feels dysfunctional, that people move to extremes and people voice those kind of extreme concerns. And so, yes, it feels like there is a role to be played and a role to be voiced and expressed in terms of tackling extremism and difficulty head on. But this is a whole policy approach, isn't it, that would actually calm these sorts of extreme views.
You're right. And the failure of the economy to grow and the fact that people have just seen a progressive diminution of their living standards is a huge part of the problem right across the West. And it is a whole other discussion about how you actually get the growth that you need. So yes, you've got to do that. But let me also say that we have got to, I think, be much more robust in defending our democracy, no matter how difficult the times are. And while there is nothing that's going to be as effective, I think, in the longer term of having a sense that democracy is back working again and delivering for the public. In these difficult times, we've got to work much harder at looking at the ways in which Iran, for example, is embedded within our in our public life, the ways in which it is subverting charities, the ways in which the British economy can be vulnerable to effectively paying through the Iranian shadow oil economy to funding the kind of extremism that then is re-injected into our economies. You can't, I think, there's a danger sometimes that the left's answer to everything is rise and liver standards, which is really important, but one, it's hard to deliver, and you must not forget the hard stuff that we need to do to keep people safe in the interim.
Lord Walney, John Woodcock, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for your time. It is so nice to speak to you at length and to hear your brain out loud. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Calum. Thanks, Kirsty.